Fanmot. The envelope was thin in the way that only bad news ever is, not the fat important kind that contains contracts or acceptance letters, but the kind that holds a single folded page and nothing else. Marcus Webb stood beneath the flickering fluorescent tube at Ray's Auto Repair on a Tuesday afternoon in March. The paper crisp between fingers, still dark with engine grease, and he already understood what it said before he finished the first sentence. He read it anyway twice because hope is a stubborn and irrational thing, and the second reading felt like pressing on a bruise just to confirm it hurts. Ray appeared from the back office the way guilty men always do, slowly, reluctant, cloth in hand, that he kept working between his palms, even though it wasn't doing anything useful. His face carried the weight of someone who'd been rehearsing an apology for days and still hadn't found the right version. Marcus didn't make him deliver it. He folded the letter along its original crease and slipped it into the front pocket of his work jacket, where it sat against his ribs like a small stone. Ray's voice went through the expected motions: restructuring, financial constraints. Best mechanic I've had in 6 years, first call when things turn around. And Marcus nodded through all of it because there was no version of this conversation that ended differently, and prolonging it wouldn't change the arithmetic. He shook Ray's hand. He walked out through the service bay, where he'd spent 6 years diagnosing what was wrong with things and figuring out how to make them run again, and he pushed through the heavy door into the Los Angeles afternoon without looking back. His truck sat at the far end of the lot, a 2004 Ford with rust working steadily through both rear wheel wells and a heater that only worked on the driver's side. He climbed in, pulled the door shut against the noise of the boulevard, and sat with the engine off for 30 seconds. He allowed himself those 30 seconds. He'd learned early on that refusing to feel things didn't make them smaller. It just made them leak out sideways at the wrong moments, usually in front of Cora, and she didn't need to carry his fear alongside her own small, ordinary 6-year-old worries. So he sat with it. The panic. The specific cold arithmetic of a checking account balance of $312 set against rent of $1,400. Due in 9 days, 2 months of overdue tuition at Bright Path Academy, adding up to $620. The groceries in the apartment that would stretch maybe 4 days if he was careful. If Cora didn't notice he'd stopped eating breakfast. He let the math be what it was, a cliff he was standing at the edge of. Then he opened his phone and looked at the photo he always went to first. Cora at Griffith Park 3 weeks ago, spinning on the old tire swing, with both arms thrown out like she was trying to hug everything at once. Her dark curls had been wild in the wind, and her front tooth had just come out that morning, and the gap in her smile made her grin look enormous. She'd laughed so hard she kept losing her grip and then grabbing on again, shrieking, and Marcus had stood 10 feet away thinking that this right here, exactly, this was what he was working for. Not the abstract future, this specific joy. He stared at it until the cold arithmetic in his chest became something he could function inside of. He started the truck and pulled onto the boulevard, heading toward Bright Path Academy and whatever came next. Cora hit him at the knees the moment he stepped into the aftercare pickup area, both arms locking around his waist with the full-body commitment that 6-year-olds bring to everything. He scooped her up, and she launched immediately into the day, the baking soda volcano that had erupted bigger than anyone expected, the class hamster who'd escaped and been found inside a hollowed-out copy of Charlotte's Web, the fact that her best friend Sophia had a new backpack with a mermaid on it that actually changed colors in the sun. Marcus listened to all of it with his full attention, asked questions, laughed at the right moments, and didn't let her see the letter-shaped weight sitting against his ribs. At dinner, she asked about the Science Museum. He told her maybe. She accepted it with the quiet pragmatism of a child who has learned that maybe usually means the budget is being considered. Not that the answer is no. She understood more than he let himself think about, not the details, but the shape of their situation, the way some things required waiting and some things required working, and her father did a lot of both. She told him once around her 5th birthday that she knew he worked hard so they could stay together. He hadn't been able to speak for a full minute after that. After she was asleep, the apartment settling into its familiar sounds, the upstairs neighbor's television, the refrigerator that hummed a half-step sharp, the occasional complaint of the building's old plumbing, Marcus opened his laptop at the kitchen table, the one with the wobbly leg he'd been meaning to fix for months, and started searching. He applied to 14 jobs between 9:30 and midnight. Warehouse associate on the night shift in Compton. Delivery driver must have clean record. Marcus had a clean record. Line cook at a sports bar in Culver City that wanted 2 years of experience he didn't have. Two mechanic positions at shops across town, both listings at least 3 weeks old. A facilities maintenance role at a hospital in Torrance that paid slightly less than his previous job, but had benefits. He filled out each application with the same careful attention he brought to a diagnostic on a car he'd never seen before, methodical, honest, thorough. None of them started immediately. The fastest turnaround, assuming anyone called back, was probably 2 weeks. Two, he was about to close the laptop when the listing appeared in a sidebar flagged by an aggregator site he'd never used before. The formatting was different from the others, spare, almost deliberately minimal, like whoever wrote it had chosen each word with the specific intention of saying as little as possible. Live-in personal assistant, private residence, Beverly Hills. Immediate start, $4,800 per month. Private accommodations and meals provided. Seeking reliable, discreet individual for full-time assistance to private client. Duties include household management, scheduling, personal support. Must be adaptable, professional, available around the clock. Prior caregiving experience preferred but not required. Background check mandatory. Serious inquiries only. And below that, a single additional line that most listings don't include: warning, previous 11 applicants did not complete the first month. Marcus read that line 3 times. Not because he didn't understand it, but because he was trying to figure out what it meant about the person who'd added it. There were two possibilities. Either whoever wrote the listing was trying to discourage time wasters filtering for people who'd stop reading there, or they were being honest about something difficult in a way that most employers never are. The second possibility was stranger and more interesting, and it was what made him click apply before the practical part of his brain could list the reasons not to. Beverly Hills. Live-in, meaning Cora would sleep here without him most nights. $4,800 a month, which would cover everything. Rent, tuition, food, Mrs. Park's hourly rate, and leave enough to start rebuilding the cushion that had been slowly eroding for the past 18 months. He typed his cover letter at the kitchen table with the wobbly leg, brief and honest. No formal caregiving background. 6 years as a diagnostic mechanic, raised a child alone for 4 years. Understands that showing up and not quitting are different skills, and he has both. He hit submit at 12:47 in the morning and went to bed. The call came 2 days later, mid-afternoon, from a number with no name attached. The voice on the other end was female, professional, and economical. She introduced herself as Renata, said she was calling on behalf of Miss Diana Holt, confirmed Marcus's interest in the position, and told him he had an interview the following afternoon at 2 o'clock. She would text the address. He should be punctual. The line closed before he could ask what he'd actually be doing, or why 11 people before him had apparently decided the answer was nothing good. He Googled Diana Holt that night after Cora was asleep. The results were substantial. CEO of Holt Technologies, a data infrastructure company she'd founded at 24 out of a converted garage in Pasadena, with a business partner who'd left 2 years in, and a credit line she'd maxed out twice before the company found its footing. Forbes profiles industry, awards a TEDx talk about building systems that outlast their creators. She was 38. The most recent photos were from industry events about 2 years ago, then a gap, then a handful of more recent images where she appeared in a wheelchair posture, impeccable expression, unreadable. The coverage of the accident was sparse, a single paragraph in a tech industry newsletter mentioning she'd been involved in a collision on Pacific Coast Highway and would be taking time away to focus on recovery. No follow-up, no statement. The story had simply stopped. Marcus closed the laptop and sat for a moment with what he now knew. Then he went to check on Cora, straightened the blanket over her sleeping shoulders, and reminded himself that understanding the whole picture was less important than showing up. The driveway alone was longer than the street he'd grown up on in Boyle Heights. He sat in his truck at the bottom of it for a moment after the gate slid open, looking up at the house, if house was even the right word for it, which it probably wasn't. It was built into the hillside like something that had decided to become architecture, all glass and steel and angles that caught the afternoon light and held it. The landscaping was the kind that costs more than most people make in a year to maintain and looks effortless, specifically because of that. Marcus's truck left small dark spots on the pristine concrete where the radiator had been running a slow drip he hadn't gotten to yet. Renata met him at the door. She was perhaps 50, composed in the way of someone who has spent years in close proximity to a demanding person and absorbed their standards without losing themselves entirely. She led him through a foyer with marble floors and ceilings that went up further than seemed structurally necessary, past rooms that looked like they'd been designed to be impressive rather than inhabited, and into a sitting room at the back of the house where the entire wall facing the city was glass. Los Angeles spread below them like a circuit board lit up at midday, and for a moment Marcus understood how the people who lived up here could come to believe that what they were looking at was the world. He heard the wheelchair before he saw her, a soft, almost frictionless movement across the floor, and then Diana Holt came into the room from a side corridor and positioned herself across from the chair Renata had indicated for him, and Marcus understood immediately why 11 people had apparently not lasted the month. She was younger than the industry profile photos had suggested, or maybe more precisely, she was more present than photographs had managed to capture sharply defined features. Dark hair pulled back in a way that left no ambiguity about the fact that she wanted nothing between her face and whatever she was looking at. Her hands rested in her lap still. Her posture was perfect in the way that costs something to maintain, and her eyes moved over him with a speed and completeness that made him feel not unpleasantly like an engine being diagnosed by someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. She didn't offer a greeting. She looked at him for a moment and then said, "You're not what I expected." Marcus settled into the chair across from her. "What did you expect?" "Someone with a background that made sense for this position. Relevant experience. References." A slight pause. "A resume that didn't require me to do interpretive work." "I don't have any of that." He met her gaze and kept it there. "I know. I read your application." Another pause shorter. "Auto mechanic. No formal training in caregiving. No degree. So explain to me, Mr. Webb, why should I spend my afternoon on you?" He could have constructed something. He was good at diagnosing problems, which included people. He'd spent 6 years figuring out what was wrong with complicated systems and making them functional again. He was reliable, detail-oriented, didn't require praise to stay on task. All of it was true and none of it was the real answer, and he'd decided on the drive up here that lying to this woman, even by omission, was probably the worst strategic decision he could make. His chest tightened as the words came out quieter than he'd intended. "Because I need this job more than anyone else you'll see today, and I don't have the option of doing it badly." Diana's expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted slightly, the way the surface of water changes when something moves beneath it. He continued because he'd started, and the only direction was through. "I have a 6-year-old daughter. I lost my job 3 days ago. We're 2 months behind on her school tuition, rent is due in 9 days, and there are 4 days of food in the apartment. I'm not going to quit when things get difficult because the only consequence of quitting is that my daughter suffers for it, and that's not a trade I'm willing to make." The silence that followed had texture to it. Diana turned her head slightly, looking toward the window in the city below it, and Marcus watched the stillness of her hands in her lap and understood that she was processing, not dismissing. "You have a daughter," she said finally, not a question, a notation. "Cora, she's 6, and you'd be willing to live here. She wouldn't be with you. I'd see her every evening. Put her to bed, make sure she knows I'm still there." He kept his voice even. "If it means I can provide for her, yes." Diana studied him for a long moment with those assessing eyes. Then she said very calmly, "I had 12 people apply for this position. Most of them stopped returning calls when Renata explained what the role actually involves. The rest didn't make it through her screening. The 11 who got to this stage quit before the end of their first month." Marcus waited. "I don't need someone who pities me," Diana continued. "I don't need someone who treats me as an inspiration or a project or a burden they have nobly decided to accept. I need someone competent, discreet, and steady, someone who doesn't disappear the first time I'm difficult to be around. And I will be difficult to be around. I'm not making that claim to test your reaction. I'm telling you because it's factually accurate and you have the right to know what you're agreeing to." Something settled in Marcus's chest. He'd worked for Ray for 6 years, and Ray had been a decent man, but the job itself had been full of customers who treated their cars better than they treated the people fixing them. He knew what it was to be underestimated by someone who needed you. He knew what it was to stay anyway. His voice carried more certainty than he'd planned when he said, "I've been raising a 6-year-old alone for 4 years. Difficult doesn't scare me." The ghost of something, not quite a smile, but the place where a smile might eventually exist, moved across Diana Holt's face and was gone. She looked at him for another moment. Then, "You won't last a week living in this house." He didn't blink. "I'm not leaving unless you fire me." The room was quiet for long enough that he could hear the city through the glass, distant and humming. Then Diana Holt nodded, once the kind of nod that is its own entire sentence. "Monday, 7 a.m. Renata will send you the contract tonight. Read it carefully before you sign it. Every line." She turned her wheelchair and began to move toward the corridor she'd come from. Marcus stood. "Ms. Holt?" She stopped but didn't turn. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said, and her voice carried something in it that he couldn't name. Not warmth exactly, but the possibility of it somewhere much further down the road. "You don't know what you've agreed to." Then she was gone, and he was standing alone in the room with the city glittering below him and the contract already on its way to his inbox. He talked to Mrs. Park that evening, after Cora was asleep, standing in the narrow hallway between their two apartments while the building settled around them. She was 68, Korean-American, had lived in 4B for 11 years, and known Marcus since he moved in with a newborn and a diaper bag, and the specific expression of a man who has no idea what he's doing, but intends to figure it out. She listened to his explanation without interrupting, nodded when he finished, and said she would take Cora every morning before school and be there when the aftercare van dropped her at 4:30. Marcus named a number, 400 a month, pulled from the math he'd already done on the new salary. Mrs. Park looked at him with the expression she used when she thought he was being foolish. "You don't pay me to love that child." He said he knew that, and that was exactly why he was paying her to watch her. She accepted it with a single nod that contained an entire argument she'd decided not to have. He sat on the edge of Cora's bed after watching her sleep in the particular configuration she always chose, one arm under the pillow, her stuffed elephant tucked against her ribs, blanket pulled up to her chin, regardless of the temperature. She was utterly trusting in sleep, which was the thing about children that most broke him open, the way they gave themselves completely to unconsciousness, because they believed absolutely that the person responsible for keeping them safe was doing that. He was 4 days from not being able to buy groceries. He had a contract on his phone from a woman who had told him directly that he would fail. He whispered to the room rather than to her because she was asleep and the room would hold it, "I'm going to fix this." Then he kissed her forehead and went to pack his duffel bag. Monday arrived with the particular quality of mornings that are going to matter: a clear sky over Easto, the kind of light that doesn't apologize for being bright, the 110 freeway moving faster than it usually did at 6:40. Marcus pulled the truck up the driveway with the duffel bag on the passenger seat and the contract signed in the cup holder. Renata met him at the door with a tablet already lit up. She walked him through the room, first, second floor, east wing, private bathroom window that faced out over the canyon rather than the city, larger than his entire apartment. He set the duffel down on the chair and didn't let himself think about that. Then she handed him the tablet and talked him through the schedule with the efficiency of someone who had delivered this briefing multiple times and intended it to land completely. 6 a.m. breakfast preparation. Black coffee, 2 eggs scrambled, wheat toast plated precisely. She showed him a photograph of the correct presentation. Toast on the left, eggs, centered coffee at 11 o'clock. 7 a.m. physical therapy session. He was to be present and assist as directed, but not to watch unless watching was necessary. 8:30 daily schedule review. The list ran until 10 p.m. "One more thing," Renata said, and her voice dropped a register, not conspiratorial, but careful. "Ms. Holt values precision and privacy in equal measure. Do not ask personal questions. Do not overstep your role. Do your job and do it well, and that will be enough." She paused. "And do not take it personally when it isn't." Marcus said he understood. She looked at him for a moment as if she was deciding whether understanding was the same as being prepared, and then she left him to figure out where the kitchen was. The first 3 days were a calibration exercise, and both of them knew it. The coffee on the first morning was too weak. He'd followed the label on the bag, which turned out to be irrelevant because Diana's preference was 4 grams over the standard ratio, and there was a small laminated card in the cabinet that he'd missed. He remade it without comment. The second morning it was too strong. He adjusted by 2 grams and got it right on the third morning, and Diana picked up the cup and drank it and said nothing, which turned out to be the closest thing to approval he was going to get for a while. The toast went on the wrong side the first time, right instead of left, which the photograph had shown clearly, meaning he'd simply reversed it in his head somehow. He moved it before she sat down, and she said nothing. The second morning he got it right. The eggs were right from the beginning because scrambled eggs were one of the things he genuinely knew how to make, having prepared them approximately 700 times for a person who would not eat them if the texture was wrong. He assisted with the physical therapy session at 7 each morning by being available and unobtrusive, which was harder than it sounded. The therapist who came to the house 3 times a week was a compact, focused man named Dr. Chen, and the work he put Diana through looked exhausting in the way that things are exhausting when they cost something real. Marcus stood near the doorway unless he was asked to assist with equipment, kept his face neutral, and did not react to the sound of her working through something that was clearly painful. He'd learned early on with Cora that the worst thing you can do for someone who is struggling is to make your distress about their struggle visible to them. It doesn't help, it just adds weight. On the fourth day, Diana knocked a full glass of water off the corner of the lunch table. It hit the marble and exploded into a wide scatter of glass and water, and she looked up from where she was sitting and looked at Marcus with an expression that was completely empty of any apology or acknowledgement. Clean it up. He got a towel from the kitchen. He knelt on the marble and collected every piece of glass he could find, working slowly, checking twice because a missed shard in bare feet at midnight is a different kind of problem than a mess at noon. He wiped the floor until it was dry. He got a fresh glass from the cabinet, filled it, and set it down at the table 4 inches farther from the edge than it had been before. His voice was level and carried no performance of patience when he said thank you. Diana blinked. The emptiness in her expression broke slightly, replaced by something that might have been confusion. For what? For testing me? Now you know I'm not going anywhere. She looked at him for a long moment with those eyes that didn't give much away but took everything in. Something in them shifted, not warmth, but the recognition that precedes it, the moment when someone stops being a category and starts being a specific person. She didn't knock anything over again after that. He noted it without comment. By the end of the first week, Marcus had learned the architecture of the household, the way he'd learned the layout of engines, not from a diagram, but from repeated contact from attention, paid to what happened when you changed one variable and what stayed the same. Diana woke at 5:30. The hour in the private gym before Dr. Chen arrived was private in the absolute sense, no entry, no interruption. And whatever happened in there left her quiet and tight-shouldered for the first 30 minutes of breakfast. He learned to put the coffee down and disappear for that half hour and return when her shoulders had dropped a centimeter. Business calls ran from 8 until noon. Her voice during them was a different instrument, precise, quick, utterly controlled, with the ability to shift in a single sentence from a collegial to incisive, in a way that clearly worked on the people she was speaking with. She ate lunch alone. Afternoon meetings, virtual or occasionally in person, continued until early evening. Dinner at 7, after which she went into her office and worked until past midnight. He noticed things that weren't on any schedule. The way her right hand developed a tremor after a long therapy session that she managed by keeping it below the table or tucked in her lap. The way she gripped the wheelchair's armrests when pain moved through her, suddenly a quick whitening of the knuckles that lasted 2 or 3 seconds before she released it. The way she sometimes stopped working at her desk late in the evening and sat very still looking at the dark window glass, and he understood somehow that she wasn't looking through it so much as using it as a surface to hold something she was carrying. He didn't ask about any of it. He learned where she kept the ibuprofen and the stronger prescription medication and the heating pad. He learned that she wanted her desk lamp adjusted to the left during video calls because the default position threw a shadow she found distracting. He learned that she preferred her tea at a very specific temperature, which he established by the simple process of bringing it slightly different each time until she stopped mentioning it. Every evening, without exception, he drove across the city to the apartment in East LA. The drive was 40 minutes in good traffic and could be over an hour on bad nights. But he had never once arrived after 9 o'clock, which was the time he'd told Mrs. Park and the time he'd told Cora. He put her to bed, sat on the edge of the mattress, listened to whatever piece of the day she needed to tell him about, and answered every question she asked honestly, except the ones about money, which he answered with the particular parental shorthand of "we're working on it and things are getting better." She asked once around the end of the first week if his boss was nice. He thought about Diana Holt's eyes measuring him from across the room and the glass she'd knocked off the table, and the precise blankness with which she'd watched him clean it up. He told Cora, "She's someone who has high standards. That's a different thing than nice." Cora considered this with the seriousness she brought to categorization problems. Like Mrs. Patterson who makes us redo the worksheet if the numbers aren't in the box. Something like that. I like Mrs. Patterson, Cora said. She's fair. He kissed her forehead and drove back to the mansion and thought about the word fair for most of the 40 minutes. Renata found him in the hallway outside the East Wing on a Thursday afternoon at the end of week one, and she didn't approach the way people approach when they want to pace or say something casual. She stopped in front of him with her arms at her sides and her face doing the thing it did when she was deciding how much to say. 6 years, Renata began, and the number carried the weight of time actually spent rather than simply elapsed. I've been with her for 6 years. I've seen this house with every version of who she's been since the accident, and I've watched 11 people try and fail to do what you're doing. She paused. You're already different from them. Marcus waited because this wasn't the end of the thought. That's not necessarily a good thing, Murray, Renata said. The ones who didn't last, most of them failed because they were incompetent or because she was harder than they expected. You're not incompetent, and her difficulty doesn't seem to bother you. That means you're going to get past the wall they hit, and what's on the other side of that wall is complicated. For both of you, I just want you to know that I'm watching, and I'm not the only one. Marcus held her gaze. I appreciate you saying that. She nodded once, studied him for another moment, and walked away. He stood in the hallway for a while after she left, thinking about walls and what it means to be someone whose job is essentially to be present inside one. It was in the second week that Cora came up in a real conversation for the first time. He'd been preparing lunch salmon, which he'd gotten right by the fifth attempt, learning that Diana preferred the skin crisped to a specific degree that required pulling it from heat approximately 90 seconds earlier than any recipe suggested, and Diana had come into the kitchen rather than waiting in the dining room. She positioned herself at the island and watched him work with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, and after several minutes she said, "You cook like someone who does it because it matters, not because they have to." His hands kept moving, knife following the grain of the fish. I have a 6-year-old who won't eat anything green unless I convince her it's something else. That requires a certain level of commitment. The smallest possible curve at the corner of Diana's mouth. How do you do it? Broccoli becomes tiny trees. Spinach goes into smoothies with enough berry that she can't taste it. Last week I told her carrots would give her night vision like a superhero. He glanced up. She ate 3 servings and spent the evening testing it. Did it work? She was very disappointed to find out it didn't. He plated the salmon with the attention it required. But she's been eating carrots voluntarily ever since, so technically I won. You take the wins where you find them. Diana was quiet for a moment, and he could feel her watching him the way she watched things she was still figuring out. How long have you been raising her alone? His hands stilled for just a moment, not long enough to be noticeable unless someone was paying close attention, and Diana Holt was always paying close attention. He set the plate in front of her and straightened. 4 years. Her mother left when Cora was 2, said she wasn't ready. He kept his voice neutral, informational. We haven't heard from her since. Diana looked at the plate for a moment. I'm sorry. Don't be. We're better off. She looked up at him with something in her eyes that he hadn't seen there before. Not pity, which he wouldn't have accepted, but recognition. The look of someone encountering a landscape that matches a map they've been carrying for a long time without knowing what it was for. My father left when I was 8, she said, and her voice was careful in the way that voices are careful with things that are still sharp. He told my mother her expectations were suffocating him. He left during dinner. We never heard from him again either. The kitchen was quiet around them. Marcus set down the cloth he'd been holding. I'm sorry, he said. Don't be, Diana replied, and her mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile but contained the architecture of one. We were better off. He held her gaze for a moment, and in the space between them, something settled, not an agreement exactly, but a shared recognition. 2 people who had learned to stop waiting for someone to come back. He picked up the cloth again and went back to cleaning the counter, and she ate her lunch at the kitchen island for the first time, and when she finished, she didn't immediately leave. She stayed for an additional 11 minutes reviewing something on her tablet, and Marcus worked around her and didn't mention it. The night it changed was a Thursday 19 days in, and it didn't announce itself. He woke to a sound at 2 in the morning that was wrong in the specific way sounds are wrong when they shouldn't be happening at all. A sharp intake of breath, then a pause, then another coming from down the hallway, with the terrible, careful quality of someone trying not to be heard. He was up and moving before he'd fully processed the sound, pulling on a shirt in the dark, his feet finding the floor without noise. Diana's door was ajar. Light came through the gap, yellow and still. He knocked once softly, nothing. He pushed the door open. She was upright in the bed, both hands gripping the sheets, with the white-knuckled intensity of someone holding on during an impact that keeps happening. Her face was pale in a way that made the shadows under her eyes look like bruising, and her entire body was caught in a fine, constant tremor that had the specific quality of something the nervous system generates rather than the muscles. When she saw him in the doorway, her jaw set immediately, and the sound that came out of her was clipped and furious even through the shaking leave. He'd seen this before, not this exactly, but the shape of it. Cora at 3 years old running a fever that had spiked too fast, her small body shaking against his chest, while he sat on the bathroom floor at 3 a.m., calling the nurse hotline with one hand and holding her with the other, and understanding for the first time in his life what it meant to be absolutely necessary and absolutely terrified at the same moment. He knew what helplessness looked like in the body, and he knew the particular stubbornness of people who refuse to be helped because being helped feels like losing something they can't afford to lose. He stepped into the room. "Tell me what you need." I said, "I heard you. Tell me what you need." Her jaw clenched so hard he could see the muscle working. Another wave moved through her, and she bent forward over it with a sound that she tried to suppress and mostly did. And when she came back up, her voice was different, stripped of the command functional only, nerve pain, medication, bathroom, second shelf orange bottle. He found it, came back with water, waited while she got the tablet onto her tongue and swallowed. Then he crossed to the chair by the window and sat down. "They take 20 minutes, she said, still gripping the sheets. "You don't have to." "I know." He settled back in the chair. "Tell me if you want me to go." She didn't tell him to go. The room held the sound of her breathing, ragged, uneven, working against something invisible. And Marcus sat with it the way you sit with things that cannot be sped up, the way he'd learned to sit at 3 a.m. with a sick child present, without pushing, available, without crowding. After a while, he began to talk. Not to distract her, she was past distraction, but because he'd found once with Cora in the grip of night terrors, that the sound of a voice describing real and ordinary things could anchor a person to the present when the present felt like it was coming apart. He spoke quietly without looking directly at her. Cora used to have night terrors when she was little, 2.5. She'd wake up screaming, and nothing I did worked, holding her, talking to her, turning on the lights. Nothing. One night I was so exhausted I just sat down on the floor next to her bed and started describing her room out loud. The lamp was blue. Her stuffed elephant was on the second shelf. There was a crack in the ceiling that looked exactly like the outline of a river. Diana's breathing had shifted slightly, still labored but different. He continued. It worked. Not immediately, it took a few minutes. But she'd stop screaming and start listening, and then she'd start breathing slower, and then she was just a little kid in a room that had a lamp and a stuffed elephant and a crack in the ceiling that looked like a river. Somewhere real, somewhere she knew. He paused. She still asked me to do it sometimes when she's scared. Diana's voice came out quiet and stripped of everything except the question, "Does it work for adults?" "I don't know. I've never tried." A silence, then try. He looked at the room. "You're in your bedroom. The walls are white. There's a painting above the dresser, abstract, mostly blues and grays. A lot of horizontal movement, looks like someone painted water from memory." He kept his voice even, unhurried. "The windows face east. The sun will come up in a few hours. The sheets are gray, high thread count." A sound from the bed, not quite a laugh, but the shape of one. "You notice the thread count? I do the laundry." He kept going. "There's a phone on the nightstand, a glass of water. The medication is working right now. You can't feel it yet, but it's working. In 15 minutes, the pain will be less. In an hour, you'll be able to sleep." He paused. "You're safe. This is temporary. The room is exactly where you left it." The shaking had begun to ease, not gone, but quieting the waves, losing frequency. Diana's grip on the sheets had loosened. She exhaled slowly, a breath that had been held for minutes, and then another. They sat in the room together for a long time without speaking, and Marcus watched the quality of her stillness change from braced to resting, and when the medication had done enough of its work, she sank back against the pillows with the specific exhaustion of someone who has been fighting something they couldn't see and has finally been allowed to stop. "Thank you," she said, and the word was so quiet he almost didn't catch it. "Anytime." He stood to go and her voice stopped him at the door. Not the command voice, Not the CEO voice, but something lower and more direct, the voice of someone who has decided to say a thing before they think better of it. She corrected herself quietly. Marcus, his first name, the first time. You didn't have to stay. He stood in the doorway with his hand on the frame and said, I know, but leaving would have been easier, and I stopped doing easy things a while ago. She looked at him, really looked at him in the way that she hadn't yet, the way that saw the person rather than the function, and something in her expression underwent a change that was small but structural, like a load-bearing wall accepting weight it had been avoiding. He closed the door quietly and stood in the hallway with his heart still moving faster than usual, understanding that he had just stepped across a line that both of them would remember. He went back to his room. He lay on top of the covers with the lights off and listened to the house settle and thought about walls and the small specific sounds they make when they begin very slowly to come down. 3 days later, Tuesday morning, he passed Renata in the kitchen doorway and she handed him a cup of coffee she'd poured for herself and then apparently changed her mind about. He was fairly sure she'd never done that before. That evening, going through the household management app on the tablet while Diana was on a call, he noticed a new calendar entry that hadn't been there the previous day, added at 2:17 in the morning, which meant she'd been awake longer than she'd let on. The entry said run extended background check on web. Personal history, full scope, not criminal only. He stood in the kitchen holding the tablet and let himself feel the precise shape of that information. Not betrayal, she didn't owe him trust she hadn't verified. Not even surprise because she'd told him herself on the first day what she needed from the people around her, and none of those things were given without evidence. What he felt was something closer to recognition. She was still guarding the door even now. Even after the room and the water, and his voice at 2 in the morning describing a painting that looked like water. He set the tablet down and went to start her breakfast. Whatever she found, he was still going to be standing in this kitchen at 6 a.m. That was the only answer that mattered. Fan high. The background check came back clean, which Diana did not mention and Marcus did not acknowledge. What changed instead was smaller and more significant than any formal verdict. She started eating breakfast in the kitchen on Tuesdays. Not every morning, not announced, not explained. The first Tuesday of week 4, he came in at 6:15 to find her already positioned at the island with her tablet open, and he adjusted without comment, set the plate where she could reach it, moved the coffee 3 inches closer, continued what he'd been doing. She ate and worked and left. The following Tuesday, she appeared again. By the third week, it had become a fact of the household, the way other things had become facts, the degree of the coffee, the angle of the desk lamp, the understanding that the 45 minutes after physical therapy were not for conversation. What changed alongside it was harder to name. She began asking questions, careful ones, spaced out so they didn't accumulate into something that looked like interest, but Marcus had learned to read the architecture of her restraint well enough to understand that the spacing was deliberate. How old is Cora now? What is she studying this week? Does she understand why you're not there in the mornings? He answered each one the same way he'd been answering everything in this house, directly without decoration. One morning she asked about Cora's mother, and his hand stilled briefly over the cutting board before continuing its work. She left when Cora was 2. He told her the same words he'd used before, but this time Diana didn't offer the reflexive condolence and move on. She waited, and the waiting pulled out the rest of it. She said the responsibility was more than she'd understood it would be, that she'd thought she was ready, and she wasn't. He finished slicing and set the knife down. She didn't say goodbye to Cora. She just wasn't there one morning. Diana looked at her coffee. Do you resent her? His voice was honest, in the way of things he'd worked out over years rather than days. Every single day, but not in front of Cora. She doesn't need to carry that weight. So I carry it where she can't see it, and I put it down when I can. Diana's fingers traced the edge of the island counter, a small movement he recognized as the equivalent of looking away without looking away. My father made the same calculation in reverse, she said. He left and apparently decided the weight belonged to us. She paused. I was 8. We were having dinner. He got up from the table and didn't come back. The kitchen was very still. Marcus set a plate in front of her with the care he brought to things that needed to be handled gently, and said nothing because nothing was what the moment needed. She ate and he cleaned, and she stayed at the island for 17 minutes after she'd finished, which was 6 minutes longer than any previous Tuesday. When she finally left, she paused in the doorway and said without turning, You can bring Cora on Saturday, if you want. This house is too quiet." Another pause and something almost dry moved through her voice. "I'd like to meet the girl who eats tiny trees." Saturday morning arrived bright and warm, the kind of Los Angeles day that makes the hills look painted. Cora walked through the front door holding Marcus's hand with both of hers, her head tilting back to track the ceiling, her mouth slightly open in the way it went when she was encountering something that exceeded her current categories. She whispered upward, "Daddy, is this a museum?" Something like that. Her head came back down and her brow furrowed with the particular purposefulness of a 6-year-old identifying a puzzle. "Does someone actually live here like sleep here?" Before he could answer, Diana came around the corner from the elevator, the architectural one flush with the wall, its existence invisible unless you knew to look, and the two of them regarded each other across the foyer with a mutual assessment of people who have heard about each other from a third party and are now performing the calibration. Cora stepped forward, tilted her head at the exact angle she always used when she was about to say something unfiltered, and delivered her verdict, "You have really pretty eyes." Diana blinked. The composed, unreadable expression she brought to every encounter did something it had never done in Marcus's presence. It simply opened, briefly like a window someone hadn't intended to leave unlatched. Then she looked directly at Cora and said, "So do you." Cora beamed with her whole face. "I'm Cora. Are you Daddy's boss?" Diana confirmed that she was. "Is he doing good?" Diana said he was doing an excellent job. Cora nodded with the gravity of someone ratifying an important document. "He works really hard, and he's really good at fixing things and reading stories with different voices." She glanced at Marcus. "You should hear his dragon voice. It's very good." Marcus kept his expression steady. Diana's mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile, but had all of its essential components. They went to the garden because Cora asked, and Diana said yes before the question was fully out. And what followed was an hour that Marcus found himself returning to many times afterward, turning it over in his mind to see it from different angles. Cora ran the perimeter of the lawn like she was mapping. It crouched over the fountain to watch the water move, discovered a monarch butterfly near the stone wall, and pursued it across the grass with her arms spread and her laughter loud enough to reach the city below. Diana sat near the glass doors and watched her, and Marcus sat nearby, watching Diana watch his daughter, and the quality of Diana's stillness was different from any other stillness he'd seen from her. It wasn't guarded. It was the stillness of someone paying close attention to something they hadn't expected to care about. Diana admitted quietly without looking away from Cora's trajectory across the lawn, "I've never thought about children as something my life had room for. I built the schedule too tight and told myself that was a choice rather than a loss." Marcus watched Cora stop suddenly and flatten herself on the grass to observe something at ground level, nose approximately 2 inches from the soil. "And now I'm wondering if I was wrong about the available square footage." A pause. "Don't read too much into that. I never read more than what's there." He glanced at her. "That's a completely different skill from noticing what's there." Cora came running back, breathless hands cupped around something she was trying not to drop. She had found a beetle glossy dark green, moving with immense dignity across her palm. She presented it to Diana with both hands extended like an offering. Diana leaned forward and examined it with genuine attention, asked its name, accepted. Cora's explanation that it didn't have one yet, but she was considering Mortimer. She suggested the beetle looked more like a herald. Cora considered this seriously and said she could be right. Later at the kitchen table, Cora drew the garden from memory, the fountain inexact and enormously detailed flowers scaled to approximately the size of the house, and in the center of it all, a figure in a wheelchair wearing a crown. She held it up and pointed, "That's you. Daddy says you help a lot of people, and you built something important. So I made you a queen." The silence that followed had a particular weight, and Marcus watched Diana receive it. Her throat moved. Her hands, which were always controlled, came up and accepted the paper from Cora with a care that would have been appropriate for something genuinely fragile. "Thank you, Cora," she managed, and her voice was different from any version of it Marcus had yet heard, stripped of its professional architecture, just a person receiving something unexpected with no preparation for how much it would matter. "I'm going to keep this." "You can put it on your wall," Cora suggested. "That's where I put things I want to remember." Marcus drove Cora back that evening and went through her bedtime routine teeth pajamas. The elephant correctly positioned 3 pages of the book they were working through and drove back to find the mansion quiet and Diana's office light visible under the door. He didn't knock. But the next morning, when Renata asked him to retrieve a file from Diana's office while Diana was in a therapy session, he went in and saw the drawing pinned to the otherwise bare wall above the desk. It was the only personal item in the room. Renata found him Thursday afternoon in the east hallway, and the way she stopped in front of him was the way she had before, deliberate, decided, not casual. But her face this time was doing something it hadn't done in week one. It was worried. "She's talking about you differently," Renata began. "Not to me directly, but I've worked with her for 6 years, and I know the difference between how she discusses people who are useful and how she discusses people who matter. You've crossed that line." She paused. "I'm not sure you understand what that means for her." Marcus waited. "Before the accident, there was a man named Thomas," Renata said. "They were together 3 years. He proposed the week before the collision on PCH. After the surgeries, after the prognosis was confirmed, he came to the hospital twice. The second time he left, while she was sleeping, left the ring on her nightstand and was gone when she woke up. She let that land. She hasn't let anyone past a certain distance since. 3 years. The hallway felt smaller than it had a moment ago. Marcus said nothing because there was nothing to say that wouldn't be inadequate. "You're tearing down walls she built brick by brick," Renata continued. "That's dangerous for both of you. If you're not serious, if there's any version of the future where you decide this isn't what you want, tell me now, while there's still something to protect." His chest was tight, but his voice came out level. "I'm not Thomas." Renata studied him for a long moment with eyes that had watched too many people make promises to be easily satisfied by them. Then something in her expression settled into acceptance rather than conviction, the posture of someone who has decided to allow a risk they cannot fully calculate. "No," she said finally, "I don't think you are." She turned to go, then stopped and added without looking back, "She's going to test you again anyway. She can't help it. Just make sure you're still standing when she does." The San Francisco conference was a 48-hour engagement keynote speech, industry panels, networking events that Diana had described to Marcus in terms that suggested she found them necessary rather than enjoyable. Renata's flu had come on hard and fast 2 days before departure, and Marcus had already rearranged his calendar and prepaid Mrs. Park the hourly rate for both nights before Diana told him he didn't need to come. His response was brief. "Renata's sick. You need someone there. I'm coming." She looked at him for a moment with the expression she used when she was deciding whether to argue and calculating whether the argument was worth the energy. Then fine, which was Diana Holt's version of thank you, and he'd learned to hear it that way. They flew up on a Tuesday morning, and Marcus spent the flight reviewing the conference schedule and mapping the venue layout from the floor plan in the provided materials, noting accessibility routes, identifying the locations of quieter rooms off the main floor where Diana could decompress between sessions. He understood by now that the public version of her polished, formidable, perfectly calibrated, required significant energy to maintain, and that the maintenance cost was higher on difficult physical days, and that a difficult physical day was more likely when the schedule was as dense as this one. The keynote was in a ballroom that seated 800 people, and she filled it. That was the only word for what she did. She walked into the space with her prepared remarks, in her voice and her complete utter command of the room, and by the time she reached the third paragraph, she had the audience in the particular silence of people who are not just listening, but thinking, reconsidering, recalibrating something they thought was settled. She spoke about infrastructure, about resilience, about building systems that hold when everything external pushes against them. She did not mention the wheelchair, the accident, or any of the things that half the room was undoubtedly thinking about in the margins of their attention. When it was done, the applause was immediate and complete, and Marcus, standing at the side of the stage, watched 800 people rise in a single motion and felt something in his chest that he hadn't been expecting, a pride that was connected to none of his ordinary reasons for pride. Not Cora's accomplishments, not his own work. Something else. Something that had to do with the specific fact of watching a person who had survived the worst thing and then refused to let survival be the whole story. Backstage, Diana's hands were shaking. She looked at them like they belonged to someone who hadn't gotten the message yet. He handed her a bottle of water, and she took it without looking up. His voice was quiet, but not soft. "You own that room." "I almost lost the thread in the second paragraph." She drank. "I could feel it going, and I had to." "But you didn't lose it. What the audience experienced was a woman who knew exactly what she was saying. That's what's real." She looked up at him then, and something moved in her face. Not the relief of someone being reassured, but the quieter thing underneath reassurance the moment when you realize you are being seen accurately. I couldn't have done this without you here. He was about to say that wasn't true, that she was more than capable alone because she was, and it was important that she know it, but a man in a tailored suit appeared at Diana's elbow. Hand extended the particular posture of someone who had prepared his opening line and intended to deliver it. The moment between Marcus and Diana broke the way glass breaks completely all at once, and with a silence that follows. Marcus stepped back into his function. He spent the next 3 hours running interference at receptions, confirming accessible routes between sessions, managing the schedule with the precision Diana required, and doing all of it from the correct distance, present, useful, and visible, when the work didn't require him. It was only later in the cab back to the hotel that he let himself examine the shape of what had been interrupted and what that interruption had left him feeling. She knocked on his hotel room door at 11:45. He opened it, and she was in the doorway in the dark suit she'd worn to the evening reception, her expression carrying the particular fatigue of someone who has performed at maximum capacity for 12 straight hours and can finally stop. "Can't sleep," she said. "Can we talk?" They sat at the window, she at the glass, he in the chair angled toward her, and the San Francisco skyline spread below them in the clear cold air, all lit glass and moving light. She talked about Rise again, the foundation she'd been building in her mind for 2 years, the rehabilitation centers for people whose insurance stopped paying before their bodies did, before their will to recover, did before they were actually ready to be discharged into a world that had already moved on without them. "I want to launch it officially next quarter," she said. "Real infrastructure, real partnerships, not a line item in the annual report." She turned from the window. "I want you to help me run it." He was quiet for a moment because the offer required the kind of honesty that can't be hurried. "I'm not qualified for something like that. You understand what it means to need support and be unable to access it. You understand what it is to fight for someone you love when the system doesn't make room for that fight." Her voice was precise the way it got when she was certain. "That understanding is not a small thing. It's what this foundation needs at its center." She paused. "I trust you, Marcus, more than I've trusted anyone in a very long time. That's not nothing either." He drove back to Los Angeles the next morning, carrying those words in the same place the termination letter had sat against his ribs 8 weeks ago. And the contrast between them was almost physical, the weight of one and the entirely different weight of the other. He picked Cora up that evening, and she launched herself at him in the parking lot, and he held her for a beat longer than usual. She noticed because she always noticed. She pulled back and studied his face with the uncanny, direct attention she'd had since she was old enough to focus. "You look different," she announced. "Like when you're thinking really hard, but it's not a bad kind of hard." He kissed her forehead. "You're too perceptive for 6 years old." "I'm almost 7, she reminded him, which was true 6 months away. But she had been almost 7 since her last birthday. The phone call from Bright Path Academy came on a Wednesday afternoon, 4 days after San Francisco, and the number on Marcus's screen was the main office line, which had never called him before. His stomach dropped before the woman finished identifying herself. She explained that Cora was physically unharmed. She asked him to come in. She said she'd prefer to discuss the specifics in person. Marcus was already standing and already looking for his keys, already running the calculation on traffic at 3:15 on a Wednesday. Diana was in a meeting when he passed the sitting room doorway on a call with 3 time zones, the kind that required her full professional apparatus. He caught her eye through the glass. She read his face in approximately 2 seconds, said into the phone, "I'll call you back," and was through the door before he'd finished explaining. She didn't wait to be asked. They made it to Bright Path in 11 minutes. Cora was sitting at the principal's office in the chair against the side wall, hands folded in her lap. Not crying, but with the aftermath of crying visible on her face, the slight puffiness, the particular stillness of someone who has used up their immediate supply of tears. Marcus crossed to her first and crouched down, and the look on his daughter's face when she saw him, the way the tension in her small shoulders released by approximately half, was something he would carry forward like a stone in his pocket, smooth from repeated handling. "Talk to me, Cora Bug. What happened?" She looked at her hands. Her voice was careful and then less careful as it went, the way a controlled release becomes just release. "He kept saying things about us, about how he said you were a servant, and that we don't have our own house because we're not, he said, we're nobodies." Marcus kept his face still and his breathing even. And I told him to stop. Her chin came up slightly, the specific posture of someone who is not entirely sorry for what they did. But he didn't. He said, I don't have a mom because nobody wanted to stay with us. The last word cracked on the way out and she pushed through it. So I pushed him, and I told him my dad was the best person in the whole world and he didn't know anything. The office was very quiet. Marcus pulled her into his arms and held her in the way that children need to be held when they have been hurt and have also not entirely behaved well completely, without reservation, in a way that separates the love from the accounting that still has to happen. Diana's voice came from behind him, and it was the voice she used in boardrooms when she had decided the conversation was going to go in a specific direction, regardless of what anyone else preferred. I'd like to understand the school's plan for addressing the source of this incident. Principal Martinez, a compact woman in her early 50s, who projected the practiced calm of someone who managed 100 small crises a week, explained the situation with the particular diplomatic precision of someone trying to satisfy everyone in the room. Zero tolerance policy regarding physical aggression. Cora would need to serve a 3-day suspension. The other students' parents had been notified. Diana's expression did not change, but something in the room's temperature shifted. You called Cora's father in to address his daughter's response to sustained verbal abuse. What consequence is the other student facing? Children sometimes say things without understanding. This child called Cora's father a servant, told her she has no mother because no one wants her family. Diana's voice was absolutely level, which made it more rather than less pointed. That language doesn't come from a child's imagination. It comes from adults at his dinner table. And your school's current response is to suspend the child who pushed back while the child who caused it faces an unspecified consequence. A pause. I want a written corrective action plan on the anti-bullying protocol by tomorrow morning. I want documentation of the steps being taken with the other student and his family. And I want to know what ongoing monitoring will look like for the remainder of the school year. Martinez looked at Diana with the expression of someone recalibrating the nature of the conversation they were in. Of course, Ms. Holt. We'll have that to you. Good. Diana's posture didn't shift. We'll take the 3 days. Cora will apologize to the other student when she returns, not for defending herself, but because physical aggression isn't the right response, and she knows that. A glance at Cora, direct and without condescension. Don't you? Cora, still against Marcus's side, nodded seriously. Yes. Then we understand each other. Diana turned her wheelchair toward the door in a motion that closed the meeting as definitively as a gavel. Outside in the afternoon sun, Cora walked between them in the parking lot, and after a moment she looked up at Diana with the particular directness she brought to things she needed to say. Thank you for being mad for me. Diana stopped the wheelchair and looked at Cora at the same level she always did, without the distance that adults often put between themselves and children. Her voice was quiet and carried something that had not been there in week 1 or week 2 or any week before this one. Always, sweetheart. Cora took her hand. Diana led her, and they walked to the car that way, and Marcus watched them and felt the edges of his life rearranging themselves around something new. In the car, Cora asleep in the back seat, within 8 minutes of pulling onto the freeway, the specific collapse of a child who has spent every reserve of emotional energy, Diana looked out the passenger window and said, quiet enough not to disturb the sleeping, the things that boy said about you being a servant, about not belonging. Marcus kept his eyes on the road. It bothered you. It made me furious. A pause. And it made me wonder whether I've contributed to that story, whether the way I structured your position, the way I structured us, gave anyone a framework to tell it. His hands were steady on the wheel. People who want to reduce other people to a single story will find the material they need regardless of how we structure anything. That's not our failure. That's theirs. She turned from the window and looked at him. You don't let things diminish you. I have a daughter who's watching how I handle things. That changes the math on what I'm willing to let shrink me. He glanced at her briefly. Besides, I know what we are. The people in that parking lot don't. She was quiet for a long moment, and then, what are we, Marcus? He didn't answer immediately. The freeway moved around them, the city cycling through its late afternoon change of light. He thought about what the honest answer was, not the careful answer, not the managed answer, but the one that was simply true. Something that doesn't have a clean name yet, he said. But it's real, I know that much. She turned back to the window. After a while, she said very quietly, as if to herself rather than to him, "So do I." That evening, after Cora was fed and settled, and finally asleep in the room she'd started thinking of as her room at the mansion, she'd begun leaving drawings there, three of them now tucked into the frame of the mirror. Diana came to find Marcus in the kitchen, where he was cleaning up. She positioned herself on the other side of the island, and he looked up and saw her face doing the particular thing it did when she had decided to say something she would normally have kept back. "My contract with you expired 2 weeks ago," she said. He set the cloth down. "I didn't renew it," she continued. "I kept paying you. That part was never in question. I want to be clear about that. But the formal contract lapsed, and I let it lapse deliberately. I wanted to see if you'd notice, if you'd bring it up, if you'd use it as a reason to renegotiate or to leave or to establish new leverage." She held his gaze with the steadiness of someone who has decided that the truth is less dangerous than the alternative. "You didn't do any of those things. You just kept showing up." He took a breath, processing the information and the shape of what it meant. His voice was measured, not cold. "I'm not angry." Something in her expression shifted, braced for a reaction that wasn't coming. "I'm hurt that you didn't trust me enough to ask directly," he continued. "But I understand why you needed the information. Everyone who was supposed to stay has left. So you needed evidence rather than words, and you set up the conditions to get it." He held her gaze. "I'm still here. Now you have it." Diana's eyes were bright with something she was working not to let become visible. "I should have trusted you sooner. You trust me now. That's the part that matters going forward." He came around the island, closing the distance, and stood in front of her, where she could look at him clearly. "But I need you to promise me something." She nodded barely. "No more tests. If you're scared I'm going to leave, ask me. Use words. Tell me what you need, and I'll tell you whether I can give it, and if I can't, I'll tell you that too." His voice dropped slightly, but didn't lose its certainty. "We either trust each other or we don't. And I choose trust. I need you to choose it too." The words she sent back were quiet and cost her something to say, but they were steady. "I choose trust." He held her gaze for a moment to let it settle. Then, before he could redirect his attention back to the safer ground of logistics and schedule and the careful maintenance of appropriate distance, Diana reached up and touched his face with one hand. Not a comfort gesture, not a clinical assessment, but the specific touch of someone reaching for something they have been not reaching for a very long time. His breath caught. "I need to tell you something else," she said. "Something I've been not saying." Her hand stayed where it was. "I didn't ask you to help run the foundation only because of your experience with need and recovery. I asked because somewhere between the first week and now you became the person I trust most in the world. And I wanted a reason for you to stay that was bigger than a job, because I knew the job would eventually end, and She stopped the sentence unfinished, the rest of it visible anyway. Then she told him about Thomas in full, the proposal a week before PCCH, the surgeries, the permanent prognosis, the 2 hospital visits. How she had been asleep the second time he came. How she had woken to find the ring on the nightstand and a note that said only "I'm sorry. I can't do this." How no one had been in the room when she read it. How she had lain there for an hour before pressing the call button, because she needed that hour to understand that the shape of her life had changed twice in 1 month, and she was going to have to find a way to carry both. "I woke up alone with the ring and a piece of paper," she said, and the flatness in her voice was not absence of feeling, but the opposite feeling pressed so tightly it had nowhere to move. "And after that, I decided that if I was going to be left, I was at least going to be the one controlling the conditions." He covered her hand with his. The warmth of it moved through him like a key in a lock. His voice, when it came, was raw in a way he wasn't trying to manage. "I see you, all of you, the CEO and the scared person and the woman who defended my daughter like she was her own. I love all of it. I love you." Her breath came out in a shudder. Her eyes searched his face for the catch, the asterisk, the fine print that would make this make sense as something other than what it was. She didn't find any. The first time they kissed, it wasn't at the end of a perfect moment. It was in the kitchen with the overhead light on and the remains of dinner in the dish rack and Cora asleep down the hall, and both of them knowing that this was the step that couldn't be taken back. Diana reached for him. He met her halfway. What happened between them in those minutes was not tentative. It was the opposite of tentative, because they had both been careful and patient for long enough that when the carefulness finally broke, what was underneath it was enormous. When they pulled apart, she looked at him with wide eyes and something that lived precisely between wonder and terror. Oh, he understood completely. Yeah. They sat together in the kitchen for a while after not working, not filling the silence with performance of normalcy, just sitting inside the fact of what had happened and letting it be as large as it actually was. Eventually, Marcus said he needed to check on Cora, and Diana said she knew, and they looked at each other with the knowledge of people who have just rearranged everything and are only now beginning to calculate what that means. He stood in Cora's doorway and watched her sleep with the elephant tucked in its proper position and felt his two worlds pressing against each other in the dark, not in conflict, but in the specific pressure of things that are trying to find their shape together. His phone buzzed. Diana. No regrets. He looked at his daughter at the room she'd been sleeping in for 6 weeks at the drawing of the fountain she'd taped to the wall at eye level for herself rather than anyone else. Then he typed back, not a single one. 3 dots. Then good. Sleep well. And then a moment later, a final message that came through as he was turning off the light. Me either. For the record. He put the phone in his pocket and stood in the dark for a moment, very still aware that something large had just become permanent. He was not frightened of it. He was something else entirely, the word for which he thought might be ready. The morning broke clear, and he drove back to the mansion while the city was still quiet. And when he got there, Diana was already awake and sitting at the island with coffee she'd made herself for the first time since he'd arrived, and she looked up when he came in, and the expression on her face was the one he'd been watching gather for weeks, guarded, becoming open, defended, becoming offered. His inbox held something he hadn't checked before leaving an email with a subject line that read, regarding Diana Holt and your future with her. The sender's name was Carol Holt. He stood in the kitchen doorway reading it while Diana drank her coffee and watched him, and he understood immediately from the address, from the subject, from the careful professional tone of a woman who had spent decades being indirect about direct intentions, that the next test was not going to come from Diana. Fan Ba. Carol Holt chose a cafe in Santa Monica, which told Marcus something before he arrived. Not her territory, not Diana's, a neutral location selected by someone who understood the value of managing context. She was already seated when he walked in at a corner table with sightlines to the door, a woman in her mid-60s who wore the particular kind of understated elegance that costs more than ostentation and is designed to look like it costs nothing. She had Diana's bone structure and none of Diana's warmth, which was a significant observation, given that Diana's warmth had taken 8 weeks to locate. She stood to greet him, offered her hand, and smiled the way people smile when they have decided the outcome of a conversation before it begins. She thanked him for coming. She said she'd heard good things about his work with her daughter. She asked about coffee with the graciousness of someone who has never in her adult life been required to ask about anything, and has therefore made a study of performing the asking correctly. Marcus sat down, ordered nothing, and waited. Carol Holt was precise in the way that people are precise when precision is a weapon they have been carrying so long they've stopped noticing the weight. She spoke about Diana's company, about the foundation, about the recovery, and the remarkable progress, and how gratifying it was to see her daughter rebuilding after such a difficult period. She used the word rebuilding 4 times in 7 minutes, which told him it was the frame she decided to work inside. Then she shifted smoothly without changing her posture or her expression. I understand you've become quite important to her. He looked at her over the table. I'd say we've become important to each other. Of course. The smile held. These situations have a natural momentum, don't they? Someone in Diana's position, isolated by circumstance, finding reliable support, it's understandable that the emotional lines can blur. She set down her coffee cup with a precision that matched everything else about her. I'm not suggesting you've acted inappropriately. I'm suggesting that what feels significant inside that house may look different from the outside. Different contexts produce different attachments. The word attachments sat between them like something she'd placed on the table deliberately. Marcus looked at it and then looked at her. Diana has always been drawn to people who need her help. Carol continued, her voice carrying the particular gentleness of a blade designed to go in without being felt. She confuses the satisfaction of being needed with the foundation of something lasting. You needed it, Brian. She gave you one. You were kind to her during a difficult time. She is understandably grateful. A pause calibrated for effect. But you're a mechanic from East LA with a child and no professional future in her world. You know that. She may not be thinking clearly enough right now to know it, but I believe you're an honest enough man to see it." He let her finish. He sat with the full weight of what she'd said and let it land completely before he responded, because the worst thing you can do when someone is trying to knock you off balance is to move before you found your footing. His voice came out even, not raised, not defended. "You left when she was 8 years old. You came back when she was on magazine covers." He watched Carol's composure develop, a hairline fracture barely visible. "I'm not saying that to be unkind. I'm saying it because the person sitting across from me is trying to protect something, and I want to understand what it actually is. Is it Diana? Or is it your relationship to what Diana represents?" Carol was quiet for the first time since he'd sat down. "Diana isn't drawn to people who need her," Marcus continued. "She's drawn to people who stay, because in her whole life almost no one has." He reached for his jacket. "I'm going to tell her about this meeting. Today. Because we don't operate on secrets." He stood left enough on the table to cover both coffees and looked at Carol Holt one final time. "I hope you figure out the difference between protecting your daughter and managing her. She deserves the first one." He walked out into the Santa Monica morning and called Diana from the parking lot and said he needed to see her when he got back. Her voice on the phone read his tone immediately. She said she'd be in the sitting room. He told her everything in the order it happened, without editorializing. Diana listened from the armchair by the east window with her hands in her lap, very still, in the way she went still when she was processing something at deep levels rather than surface ones. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, looking at the middle distance. "She drove to Santa Monica," Diana said finally, less to Marcus than to herself. "Yes." She planned the location, chose the time, prepared what she was going to say. Another pause. "She worked very hard to make sure I wouldn't hear about it." "She worked very hard to make sure I'd decide not to tell you," Marcus said. "There's a difference." Diana looked at him. The expression on her face was not hurt exactly. It was the older, more structural thing that lives underneath hurt. When a pattern repeats itself, the recognition that this particular shape of disappointment has been here before and was apparently not done. She picked up her phone and held it for a moment without dialing. The call lasted 4 minutes. Marcus stayed in the room because Diana had not asked him to leave, and because she'd said once in a different context that the point of choosing trust was that you stopped engineering situations where the other person couldn't see everything. He heard Diana's voice go through its registers, the professional surface, the layer beneath it, and then the bedrock, which was controlled, but not cold, precise, but not armored. She said she understood that her mother was concerned. She said that her mother's concern had historically expressed itself in ways that were about Carol Holt's comfort rather than Diana Holt's well-being. She said she would appreciate going forward direct communication rather than lateral conversations with people in her life. She said goodbye and set the phone face down on the arm of the chair. She sat for a moment with her eyes closed. "She said she was trying to protect me," Diana said, opening them. "I know. She's been saying that my whole life. It's always meant the same thing, that she's decided what I'm capable of and she's managing accordingly." Her jaw tightened and then released deliberately. "I'm not incapable. I've never been incapable. I built a company from a credit line in a converted garage, and I ran it from a hospital bed and then from a wheelchair, and I never once asked her for her assessment of what I could handle." Marcus said nothing because she wasn't asking him to say anything. She was saying it out loud so it would be real in the air, rather than only inside her. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me, for not deciding on my behalf that I didn't need to know." "That's not a kindness I'm ever going to take from you," he said. "The right to know things about your own life." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that had no performance in it at all. Just a woman looking at a person she had come to rely on in ways she had not anticipated and could not now imagine being without. Then she straightened in the chair and said, "Tell me what you think about the East LA site for the first Rise Again Center." He pulled up his notes. They worked for 3 hours. The conversation about moving happened on a Thursday evening in late June when the light through the terrace doors was going gold, and Cora was at the kitchen table finishing a worksheet about the water cycle while Marcus made dinner. Diana had been quieter than usual all day, not the guarded quiet of the early weeks, but the considering kind, the quiet of someone organizing thoughts that are nearly ready to be spoken. When Cora finished her worksheet and took it to show Diana, who examined it with the specific seriousness she brought to everything Cora brought to her, Marcus watched from the kitchen and let himself see clearly what had been true for some time. This was already a household. The logistics just hadn't caught up to the reality. After Cora was asleep in the room, she now thought of entirely as her own, where she kept not just drawings but her rock collection organized by color and approximate size, and her elephant, in the 3 library books she was cycling through. Diana found Marcus on the terrace and came directly to it. "You're still paying rent on the East LA apartment," she said. He leaned against the railing. 30 days left on the month. "What's the plan after that?" He was quiet for a moment, honest about the shape of what he was about to say before he said it. "I've been waiting to see how Cora settled, whether this felt stable to her or whether it felt temporary, whether she needed the apartment to feel like an anchor." "And bam!" He looked at Diana steadily. "She asked Mrs. Park last week if Mrs. Park could come visit her here sometime. Not the other way around." He paused. "She's already moved. I'm the one still deciding." Diana's hands rested in her lap. "Then decide. I don't want to make this complicated for you. What you're offering officially, structurally, that's a significant thing. If something changes, something is always going to be able to change," Diana said, and her voice carried the particular certainty of someone who has thought through this specific fear and decided to act anyway. "I've spent 3 years not doing things because something could change. I'm done with that math." She held his gaze. "Move in, both of you, not as my employee, not as a complicated arrangement, as the people who live here because you already do, and the current structure is a fiction we're maintaining for no one's benefit." He looked at her for a moment. "We tell Cora together. Give her real input." "Of course. And I keep the apartment through the end of the month. Give her the transition." "Yes." He pushed off the railing and came to stand in front of her. "Then yes, we move in." They told Cora the next morning at the kitchen table with the particular care of adults who understand that children's lives get rearranged by decisions they didn't make, and the least you can do is give them the most accurate possible map of the new terrain. Cora listened with her serious face chin slightly forward, eyes moving between them, and asked her questions in the order they mattered to her: Mrs. Park, then Sophia from school, then the room, then a dog. On Mrs. Park, Marcus said they would visit every week. On Sophia, Diana had already identified a solution. Bright Path's remaining year could be finished out, and the new school nearby better resources. Actual accountability on the bullying front, a science program, Cora would find absorbing, would start in the fall with transportation arranged and playdates with Sophia explicitly built into the schedule. On the room already, hers redecorate however she wanted, complete autonomy within the purple constraint she'd already established. On the dog, Diana said negotiable, which Cora had by now learned was a conditional yes with a timeline attached. Cora thought for 10 seconds and then looked at both of them and said, "When do we move?" He packed the apartment himself over 2 weekends. He could have let the movers Diana had hired handle everything but Cora's room, specifically the drawings, the rock collection, the elephant, the particular order of the things that had been her whole world in 400 square feet. Those he handled himself, wrapping each thing in paper with the care of someone who understands that small objects carry enormous weight when they belong to children. The rocks went in a box labeled with the color system Cora had developed because arriving at the new house and finding them already organized the way she'd organized them was a kindness that cost him 20 minutes and would mean something to her. He stood in the empty apartment before he locked it for the last time. 4 years of holding them this place, the peeling linoleum, the ceiling stain, the table with the wobbling leg he'd finally fixed 6 weeks before leaving. He'd become fond of it the way you become fond of anything that has kept you standing through hard time. The 40-minute drive he'd made every single night was ending here too, in this doorway, and he felt the weight of those miles as a kind of gratitude. All those nights arriving at 9 o'clock because he'd promised all those nights Cora had been asleep before he finished the drive, and he'd stood in her doorway anyway. He thanked the rooms without feeling foolish about it and pulled the door shut. The medical appointment came without warning in the sense that Dr. Trevor Chen's call landed on a Tuesday when Marcus was reviewing contractor bids and his mind was completely elsewhere. And the careful neutrality of Chen's voice on the phone, not alarmed, but deliberately without effect, was the kind of professional tone that is specifically designed not to suggest anything in either direction. He asked them both to come in. 2 o'clock. He said both twice. Diana was in a call that could have continued. She ended it. They drove to the clinic with the particular silence of 2 people who have discussed what a call like this might mean, and then agreed not to keep discussing it because the discussing didn't help. Marcus drove. Diana looked at her hands, and then at the freeway, and then at her hands again, and he reached over once without looking away from the road and put his hand over hers, and she turned her palm up and held on. Dr. Chen's office had the quality of rooms where important things are routinely said, not sterile but careful, the furniture arranged to support difficult conversations rather than to fill space. He pulled up imaging on his screen and spoke with the precision of someone who has learned that the most humane thing you can do for people waiting for information is to give it to them accurately and completely without prolonging the approach to it. The injury to Diana's spinal cord, he explained, had been classified from the beginning as incomplete, meaning the cord had been damaged but not fully severed, with residual nerve function below the injury level that had been documented but had not, in the first year, shown meaningful recovery. The classification mattered because incomplete injuries carried a recovery window that complete injuries did not. What the current imaging showed was a substantial decrease in the inflammation that had been compressing the surviving nerve pathways, combined with evidence of remyelination, the nerve fibers rebuilding their insulating sheath in segments that had shown no activity 18 months ago. He was careful with the word walk because medicine is careful with hope that hasn't yet been earned. What he said was that with intensive physical therapy, 3 hours daily, 5 days a week for a minimum of 4 months, Diana had a genuine and evidence-based chance at regaining significant ambulatory function. Not a certainty, not a return to her pre-accident baseline, but real movement-independent standing, possibly supported walking with assistive devices. A different life than the one the initial prognosis had described. Diana sat completely still while he spoke. When he finished, she said, "The inflammation decrease. You said lifestyle factors contributed." Chen nodded. "Chronic stress has measurable effects on inflammatory response. The reduction in your stress indicators over the past several months has been significant." She didn't look at Marcus. She didn't need to. He could feel her not looking at him the way you can feel a word before someone says it. Her voice was steady in a way that cost her something. "When do we start?" "Monday," Chen said, if she was ready. "I'm ready," Dinah said, and the certainty in it was not performance. It was the voice of someone who has just been given a reason to do a hard thing and has decided not to wait for the reason to become more convenient. In the car, she broke down finally the way she'd been not breaking down for the entire appointment. Suddenly and completely, both hands over her face, the sound of it, the specific sound of relief arriving in a body that has been bracing against the opposite for 3 years. Marcus pulled into a lot off the boulevard and put the car in park and held her across the console as well as geometry permitted, which wasn't perfectly, but was entirely. She cried until there was nothing left to cry, and then she sat up and wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked at him with reddened eyes that were the most unguarded he'd ever seen them. "I don't know if I can do this again," she said. "The hope. If I build towards something and it doesn't, then we deal with what's actually in front of us," he said. "Not the version that might happen, and whatever is actually in front of us, we deal with it together." He held her gaze. "But what if it works? What if you try and it changes everything?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at him, and then something in her face made a decision. She turned back to the front of the car. "Let's go get Cora." The therapy was exactly as brutal as it had any right to be. 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, with a team Chen had assembled that combined his existing knowledge of Diana's history with specialists in spinal cord rehabilitation and neuromuscular re-education. The exercises in the first week looked deceptively simple, standing at the parallel bars with full support, shifting weight from one hip to the other in increments small enough to seem trivial, and produced a level of exhaustion that left Diana silent and tight-jawed for hours afterward. Her body was being asked to relearn the basic grammar of movement, and it objected the way bodies object to being asked to do things they have stopped believing they can do. Marcus drove her. Every session stayed for everyone she wanted him to stay for, and left the room when she needed him out of it, which was approximately 1 session in 4, and always the ones where frustration was overtaking effort. He'd learned that watching him watch her during the hardest moments added a layer she couldn't afford: the awareness of being witnessed at her lowest, the energy spent on managing that awareness, and that the most useful thing he could do on those days was to be immediately available from outside the door. He brought her back each afternoon to the kitchen, where Cora had left the daily card propped against the fruit bowl. The cards were small and insistent, and entirely Cora crayon drawings of Diana standing taller, each time captions, in the large uneven letters of a child who is learning that handwriting requires practice, and is not particularly deterred by that fact. You got this. Stronger every day. I love you. Keep going. Diana read each one on the day it appeared and kept every one of them. By the sixth week, the board in the home therapy room was covered, and Cora had started putting them in chronological order, which she explained to Marcus was so Diana could see her own progress from left to right. The first real milestone came 7 weeks in on a Tuesday afternoon when the afternoon light was coming through the therapy room windows at the specific angle that made everything look slightly more possible than usual. Diana was at the parallel bars with her brace adjusted to minimum support, her physical weight distributed between her hands and her legs in a ratio that had been shifting incrementally in the direction of her legs for 2 weeks. Chen called the time. 45 seconds standing with her hands resting on the bars rather than bearing through them. Chen's team applauded. Marcus from his chair in the corner felt the tears arrive before he decided to cry, which happens sometimes with things that matter too much to approach carefully. He didn't try to stop them. Diana looked at him from the bars, and the expression on her face, the specific combination of exhaustion and disbelief and the first small installment of a joy she hadn't let herself feel yet, was something he knew he would carry for the rest of his life. That night, she stood in their bedroom with only the cane for balance 3 steps from the wall, legs shaking at a frequency that was visible but decreasing, and she looked at him across the room and said, "Look at me." Not a request, a statement, an announcement. He looked and he did not look away, and the words that came out were barely above a breath, "There you are." She laughed and it broke something open in the room, the particular laughter of enormous relief arriving as sound, and then her legs gave exactly the amount they were always going to give, and he crossed the room and caught her, and they held each other on the edge of the bed while her breathing slowed, and she kept laughing, and he held on. The breakthrough came 4 months into the intensive work on a morning in early October, when Los Angeles had woken into the kind of clear, specific light that the city produces only in the weeks after the heat breaks. Diana walked into the therapy room under her own power. Not from the hallway outside, not from the adjacent space from the elevator, down the corridor through the door. 31 steps, leg braces, a single forearm crutch she'd been working toward for 6 weeks, and herself moving through the room at a pace that had nothing to do with speed and everything to do with intention. Chen stood at the opposite wall with his hands in his coat pockets, in the specific stillness of a professional encountering an outcome that exceeds the model. His team stopped what they were doing. Nobody said anything for a moment, because sometimes the appropriate response to something remarkable is to let it be remarkable before you put words on it. Diana reached the far wall, turned around, and looked at the room from its other side. "I told you I could do it," she said, and the quiet in her voice was more powerful than any volume she could have given it. The applause that came was the kind that happens when people are genuinely moved rather than performing acknowledgement, and Marcus, in the doorway where he'd stood to give her the full length of the room, felt it move through him the way music does when the particular combination of notes finds something specific in you. That evening, she walked into the kitchen where Cora was at the table, head down, over a reading assignment, pencil moving. Cora looked up at the sound of footsteps. Real footsteps, not wheels. And the sequence of her face took approximately 2 seconds before she was out of the chair and across the room, and Diana stood at the counter with one hand resting on the edge for balance and caught her. "You're walking," Cora said into Diana's shoulder, her voice doing the thing voices do when they're carrying more than one emotion at the same time. "I'm walking." Diana's arms came around her. "Not perfectly, not without help, but I'm walking." Cora pulled back and looked up at her with eyes that were absolutely certain. "I knew you could. I kept the cards in order so you could see. Did you see?" "I saw every one of them," Diana said, and her voice was steady only because she was working to keep it that way. Cora turned and found Marcus in the kitchen doorway and pointed at him with the no-nonsense directness of a child delivering a verdict. "Daddy, she's walking." He leaned against the frame and let the moment be as large as it was. "I see her, Bug. I see her." The Rise Again Rehabilitation Center opened on the second Saturday of November in a converted industrial building in East OA that had been transformed over 8 months of construction into something functional and human. At the same time, high windows, warm light equipment, calibrated for accessibility, at every level. Waiting rooms with actual art on the walls, because Diana had specified it, and Marcus had found the artists, 3 of whom were themselves in recovery from injuries that had taken significant function. The neighborhood was intentional. The first center was not going to be in a part of the city that already had resources. It was going to be here where the need was, and the second would be somewhere the need was equally great, and that was the architecture of everything they were building. The ceremony was larger than Marcus would have chosen. Press local officials, a state senator who had championed the accessible healthcare bill that Rise Again's founding had partially catalyzed. But Diana moved through it with the particular ease of someone who has stopped performing and started simply being, which produced a more compelling version of her than any performance had managed. She stood at the podium on her own, the forearm crutch at her right side, and the audience registered it and then moved past it because she was already talking, and what she was saying was more interesting than what she was doing. She talked about the accident and the hospital and the years that followed, and she talked about them plainly without the inspirational framing that these stories usually get pressed into. She said she had spent a long time believing that her life after the injury was a reduced version of the life she'd been living, and that the task was to make the best of it. She said she had been wrong and that being wrong in that specific direction had cost her more than the injury had. Her eyes found Marcus and Cora in the front row, and she paused for exactly long enough to let the pause carry its meaning. I found people who saw me accurately, who stayed without being asked to who fought alongside me rather than for me, and who reminded me not by saying it, but by the daily fact of how they lived, that survival was never the goal. Living was the goal. Being whole was the goal. She let it settle. This center exists because someone stayed when leaving would have been easier. We are going to pay that forward. For everyone who walks through these doors, we are going to stay. After the ceremony, after the press and the handshakes and the tour of the therapy spaces that would open for patients the following Monday, Diana gathered the people she actually wanted to talk to, Renata Dr. Chen and his core team Mrs. Park, who had driven herself up from East LA in her 10-year-old Civic and was standing near the refreshments with the contained satisfaction of a woman who knows she has been part of something, and in that smaller circle, she announced the scholarship. The Cora Webb Scholarship. Full support tuition, childcare costs, living expenses for single parents pursuing education or career changes in the healthcare and rehabilitation fields. The first cohort, 6 recipients selected beginning in January. She had the paperwork. Cora, who had been standing at Marcus's side through the announcement, looked up at him when her name registered, and her face moved through the information with the processing speed of someone encountering something too large for immediate comprehension. She looked at Diana. You named it after me. Diana crouched down, a motion she could manage now carefully with a hand braced on Marcus's arm to be level with her. You are the reason your father kept fighting. You're the reason he walked into my house and didn't leave. And you're the reason I started believing that some things were worth fighting back for. She held Cora's gaze directly. It's your name on this. It should be. Cora absorbed this for a long moment, and then she asked with the perfect practical logic of a child who has heard something important and is already thinking about implementation. Can I help pick the families? Yes, Diana said. We'll do it together. Cora nodded as if this was the expected answer and reached for a piece of cake from the table behind her. The conversation concluded to her satisfaction. Renata, standing nearby, pressed her lips together over a smile she was not entirely managing to contain. The proposal happened 6 weeks after the center opened on a Tuesday evening in mid-December in the home therapy room where Diana still worked most nights. He found her between the parallel bars, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that she was not holding them. She stood in the center of the space with her hands at her sides and her feet planted at shoulder width and her attention directed entirely inward at the specific work of maintaining her own balance against the continuous quiet argument her nervous system was having with gravity. She heard him in the doorway and said without turning, 6 minutes. He came into the room quietly and stood where she could see him without turning her head. Does it still feel the same as the first time? No. She shifted her weight slightly, testing a movement that was now controlled where it had previously been terrifying. The first time it felt like surviving. Now it feels like mine. He sat in the chair against the wall, the same chair he'd sat in at 2 in the morning months ago, in a completely different room in a completely different moment that had somehow led in a direct and unbroken line to this one. He watched her stand in the quiet room with the city glow coming through the window and thought about the man who had applied to a job posting on a desperate night and understood clearly that whatever he'd been looking for back then, he had found something larger. Diana took a step away from the bars, then another. Then she turned and walked toward him 4 steps and stood in front of him. Her legs had the slight tremor that cold or effort produced, but they held. They held the way things hold when they have been rebuilt from the inside and not from the outside. His voice was low. "You're not holding anything." "No." She looked at him for a moment, and the expression on her face had no architecture in it at all. No strategy, no management, no performance of composure. It was just her direct and without reservation looking at the person she had chosen. "Marry me." He was still for a beat. "I've thought about it for weeks," she said before the silence could become anything other than what it was. "I've thought about whether to say it and how to say it and whether to wait for a more appropriate moment. And then I realized I've been waiting for appropriate moments for my entire adult life, and all the important things happened in the inappropriate ones." Her voice was steady and also completely undefended, which he had learned was the most Diana Holt version of vulnerability that existed, choosing to be seen without armor and standing there anyway. "I want to be your wife. I want to be Cora's, whatever she needs me to be, mother, stepmother. Just Diana, I don't need the title. I need the fact. I want us to be a family in every official, legal, permanent sense, because we already are in every other sense. And I'm done pretending the paperwork doesn't matter when it does." He stood up from the chair, which put him close enough that she could have reached for him without extending her arm fully. "Are you sure?" "I've been sure of fewer things," she said, which was Diana Holt's version of absolute certainty. He said yes the way he'd said yes to the job months ago, without hedging, without qualifying with the complete weight of the word behind it. Then he said it again differently, because the first time was an answer and the second time was a promise. She reached for him and he came to her, and they stood in the therapy room holding each other while the city moved outside the window, and he thought about the arc of the last year. The letter that had taken the floor out the driveway he'd driven up in a rusting truck. The woman who had told him he would not last a week, the version of himself that had sat in that truck for 30 seconds and decided he was not allowed to fail. And he understood that none of those moments had been obstacles to this one. They had been the material of this one. They asked Cora the next morning because that had always been non-negotiable, and because Cora had earned the right to real information and real input, and had consistently demonstrated that she would use both wisely. She listened the way she listened to important things, completely without fidgeting, with her full attention directed at both of them across the breakfast table. Then she said, "So Diana would be my mom." Diana met her eyes with the directness she'd learned Cora required. "If that's what you want to call me, or just Diana or anything at all. What matters is the real thing, not the name for it." Cora considered this for exactly 10 seconds, and then she said, "You already feel like my mom, so the name can just catch up." She reached for the orange juice. "Can I be the flower girl? And can we have cake? And I think this counts as the special occasion for the dog." Marcus looked at Diana. Diana looked at Marcus. "Negotiable," she said. Cora set down her glass. "She keeps saying that, and it always means yes." They got married on a Saturday in late December in the therapy room at the Rise Again Center, which had been Diana's idea and was the correct one. The room where she had first stood unsupported, where the parallel bars had held her while she remembered how to be in her body, where Cora's drawings had covered a board from left to right in chronological order of a fight that had been worth fighting. This room made sense as a place for a beginning, because it was already a place where impossible things had turned out to be possible. The guest list was small and exactly right. Renata, who had cried once already in the parking lot before the ceremony, and was now composed with the specific composure of someone who has used their allocated emotional expenditure and is operating on reserve. Dr. Chen and his core team. Mrs. Park, in a blue dress she had bought specifically for the occasion and mentioned only once. A handful of people from the Foundation's early work colleagues who had stayed through the complicated year. No one who was there for appearance. Cora walked in first, ahead of everyone, in a purple dress she had selected herself, with the complete confidence of a person who knows her own aesthetic and requires no outside validation. She carried sunflowers because she decided they were cheerful, and cheerful was appropriate, and she walked to the front of the room with the bearing of someone taking her responsibilities seriously, which she was. Before the ceremony began, Diana turned to Cora and held her gaze with the same directness she brought to everything that mattered. "Before I do this, I want to ask you something officially. Is it okay if I marry your dad, if I become part of your family?" Cora held the sunflowers against her chest and delivered her answer with the uncomplicated certainty of someone who has already lived the answer for months. "You're already part of our family. This is just so everybody knows." The ceremony was short and completely sufficient. They had each written their own vows, which was the only version Marcus had been willing to consider because borrowed words were for people who hadn't earned their own. He spoke about showing up, about the difference between being present and being available, about a year that had begun in the specific fear of losing everything and had become the specific fullness of having everything that actually counted. He said that he had learned from the woman standing in front of him that the hardest things and the most beautiful things are frequently made of the same material, and that what determines which one you end up with is whether you stay to find out. Diana's vows were fewer words and contained more weight per word, which was her natural register. She said she had spent 3 years building walls that were specifically designed to outlast any attempt to cross them. She said she had met someone who had not tried to cross them and had simply lived inside them with patience and without complaint until the walls had become irrelevant. She said she had learned from him that trust was not a feeling that arrived before commitment, but a practice that grew inside it, and that she intended to keep practicing for the considerable remainder of her life. When it was over and they had been pronounced and had kissed in front of the people they loved, Cora stepped forward from her position at the front and wrapped both arms around their legs from below, which was her version of completing the picture. The room laughed. Cora did not, because she was not making a joke, she was making a fact. Later at the reception in the adjacent room that Renata had transformed into something warm and specific and nothing like a generic celebration, Marcus stood with Cora on his shoulders and watched Diana move through the people she loved, animated and unguarded and laughing at something Dr. Chen had said, with the laugh she'd had since around week 6, the one that came from wherever the real things lived in her, not from the surface. He watched her and thought about the 11 people who had not lasted a month and wondered if any of them had seen the version of her that was visible right now, and decided that they couldn't have because you could not see this and leave. Cora's hands rested on top of his head lightly, the casual proprietary comfort of a child who knows her perch is secure. She said from above him, "Daddy, are you happy?" He did not hesitate. "I am so happy I don't entirely know what to do with it." She patted the top of his head with her palm, twice the way she sometimes patted the elephant when she was endorsing something. "Good," she said. "I told you she made you smile different." Diana crossed the room to them, and when she was close enough, reached down from Marcus's shoulders, and Diana reached up, and their hands met in the middle, and the three of them stood like that in the middle of the room they had built together in the city that had held all of it, while the people who had witnessed the year moved around them. They went upstairs later after the guests had made their way out and the caterers had cleared, and Renata had done the last efficient survey of the room and said goodnight with the expression of someone who has watched something end well and considers that outcome personal. Cora was asleep in the room down the hall, her purple walls and ceiling stars doing what they were built to do. Mrs. Park had kissed her forehead 3 times before leaving, which Cora had accepted without opening her eyes. The terrace was cold and clear, late December, doing what December occasionally meant in Los Angeles. Real cold, the kind that makes the city lights look sharper, more individual, each one a specific source rather than a general glow. Diana stood at the railing with her hand on it, steadying her breath visible in the air. Marcus stood beside her, and they looked at the city together for a while without needing to structure the silence. "Mrs. Holtweb," he said, testing the sound of it. "Professionally Holt," she said, "but I like the full name. It sounds like something that was assembled from 2 separate things and is stronger for it." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him with the specific ease of a body that has decided it belongs somewhere. Below them, the city moved through its late-night business light and traffic, and the million separate lives that don't know each other and are all happening at once, which was Los Angeles's great strange fact. And also when you were standing above it at the end of a day like this, its great strange consolation. She was quiet for a while and then said, "I keep thinking about the man who drove up my driveway in a truck that was losing a radiator fight. How different he looked from what I needed and how completely wrong I was about what needing something could look like." "You were accurate," he said. "I was exactly what the listing said, no formal qualifications, no references, no experience in the field. You were precisely the wrong thing on paper and exactly the right thing in practice," she said, "which is true of most things that matter." He held her a little tighter against the cold. "I meant what I said today, about the hardest things and the most beautiful things." She turned her head to look at him. "So did I, about all of it." They stood there in the cold, clear air above the city, while the year they had lived gathered itself into something that would from now on be simply called the beginning. Behind them, the house held Cora and the rock collection and the purple walls and the drawings and all the ordinary evidence of a life being lived forward with full attention. Before them, the work they had built continued in the city below the center, the scholarship, the people who would walk through those doors next Monday and the Monday after that, each of them carrying something that needed staying with. This was the part Marcus had not been able to see from the parking lot of Ray's Auto Repair, sitting with the letter against his ribs and the photo of Cora on his phone and the knowledge that failure was not available to him as an option. He had not been able to see that the person he was fighting for was more than one person, or that the life he was fighting for had more room in it than he dared to imagine, or that the wall he was about to spend months learning to live inside would eventually quietly without announcement simply become home. He had known only one thing clearly back then, that showing up was different from being present, and that presence was different from staying, and that staying real, staying chosen, staying when leaving would be easier was the one thing that could not be faked or supplemented or replaced by anything else. He had stayed. She had stayed. Their daughter was asleep down the hall in a purple room under paper stars, trusting completely as she always had that the people responsible for keeping her safe were doing exactly that. He pressed his lips to Diana's temple and felt her exhale slowly, the long breath of someone putting down a weight they had been carrying for long enough that they had stopped noticing it was there. Below them, Los Angeles moved and hummed and blazed with its 10,000 separate lives. Above them, the sky was clear and cold and full of actual stars, and Marcus Webb, who had driven up this driveway in a rusting truck with a duffel bag and a desperation he could not afford to show, stood at the edge of everything he had not known he was fighting for and stayed.